Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ambassador Robert Finn from Princeton's prize-winning collection of ex-ambassadors. I'm in the Woodrow Wilson School and also in Near Eastern Studies. And it's my privilege and honor to introduce today my colleague, Ambassador Barbara Bodine, who's going to speak about Iraq, Cassandra's Curse and Pandora's Box. Ambassador Bodine is a lecturer and diplomat-in-residence at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School, where she teaches courses on the Iraq War and on U.S. diplomacy in the Middle East. Her career of over 30 years in the Foreign Service was spent primarily on Arabian Peninsula and Persian Gulf issues, specifically bilateral and regional policy. I might overcome with emotion, I just have a cold. Strategic security issues, counterterrorism, governance, and reform. Her tour as ambassador to the Republic of Yemen, 1997 to 2001, saw enhanced support for democratization and increased security and counterterrorism, among other things. Ms. Bodine also served in Baghdad as Deputy Principal Officer during the Iran-Iraq War, which you all know, Kuwait as Deputy Chief of Mission during the Iraqi invasion and occupation of 1990-1991, and again seconded to the Department of Defense in Iraq in 2003 as the Senior State Department official and the first coalition coordinator for reconstruction in Baghdad and the central governance. In addition to several assignments in the State Department's Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs, she was Associate Coordinator for Counterterrorism Operations and later Coordinator, Director of East African Affairs, Dean of the School of Professional Studies at the Foreign Services Institute, and Senior Advisor for International Security Negotiations and Agreements in the Bureau of Political and Military Affairs. After leaving government, she taught at a small school in Massachusetts that you may have heard of, Harvard, and she was also at MIT, and before that she was at the University of California at Santa Barbara. She is the recipient of a number of awards, including the Secretary's Award for Valor for her work in occupied Kuwait, the Secretary's Career Achievement Award and Distinguished Service Award, the Distinguished Alumni Award from UC Santa Barbara, and also many other recognitions. She is a graduate of the University of California, Santa Barbara, Phi Beta Kappa, and magna cum laude, and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. She's a past regent of the University of California. It's a great honor to have her with us today. And to put us in the right mood, I thought I'd read you part of a poem that I came across this morning by the famous Pakistani poet Faiz Ahmed Faiz, which says, Tumhu keho kya karna hai, you tell us what to do. When we lowered the boat of our existence into the river run with pain, how powerful our arms were, how crimson the blood in our veins. We were sure that after just a few strokes of the oars, our boat would enter its haven. That's not how it happened. Every current was treacherous with unseen maelstroms. We foundered because the boatmen were unskilled, nor had the oars been properly tested. Whatever investigation you conduct, whatever charges you bring, that river is still there, the same boat too. Now you tell us what can be done. You tell us how to manage a safe landing. Ambassador Bodine.
Thank you. I have a copy of that poem. It's depressing, but good. Unfortunately, speaking of depressing but good, second. I keep forgetting that I really need these things. If I make the speech big enough that I can read it without this, I end up with like an 87-page speech because it's got this thick and chain stuff. But anyway, that happens. What I'm going to talk to you about this afternoon, hopefully for about half an hour, and then turn it over to questions and comments, is what I call Cassandra's Curse and Pandora's Box, the lessons and legacies of Iraq. I was at an academic conference about a year ago, forecasting out on international jihadism about 5 years. And with absolutely every conference, at least that I go to, it inevitably turned to Iraq and its legacy for the region and for the U.S. more broadly. One member of the audience, with only a very thin patina of scholarly respect in his tone, denounced the panel as neither reputable academics or experienced practitioners. He said that we were little more than journalists creating instant history, and he made it clear that a decent interval needed to pass before assessments and judgments on the lessons of Iraq can properly be made. And I agree with him. History takes time, and that is a truism worthy of being chiseled over almost any door. Much of the analysis found in the media, and even in the ever-expanding bookshelf labeled Iraq at Borders, the books lack depth and perspective. There are exceptions, but much of it is, quite honestly, instant history. The memoirs and biographies add a prism through which the actors saw Iraq or wishes us to see Iraq, but these have a tendency to go towards what I believe is just self-apology. I also disagree with the member of the audience who denounced us. Debate cannot await the fullness of time to begin, nor can it be deflected with a lot of happy talk, victory by acclamation, orthodoxies, exploitation and expropriation of legitimate patriotism, or denunciation of critics as just one step shy of material support for terrorists. Even those who have finally recognized the hollowness of happy talk now plead at least for patience, unquestioning support, unexamined patience, before we debate, make judgments, or any changes. If history takes time as a truism, then so does the wisdom that if we are to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past, even the near past or the ongoing past, we need to candidly and openly examine that past. How can you judge either success or victory without the motivations and objectives being clearly examined? How do you shape future policy if you cannot see clearly the roots and the consequences of your current actions? Such judgments reflect understandings and assumptions about why we went in the first place. How do you judge whether you've attained those objectives if you can't agree on why you went in? It's a little bit like Alice's conversation with the caterpillar. Such judgments reflect understandings and assumptions about the motivations and the makeup of the Sunni insurgents, the Shia militia, the foreign jihadis, and the neighbors. Such judgments reflect understanding and assumptions on what the Iraqi political structure can reasonably attain. And finally, such judgments reflect understanding and assumptions on how much control, much less influence, does the U.S. have over either the security or the legitimacy of the Iraqi state. Let's go back quickly and just review what were some of the publicly stated goals and objectives. They're very well known. I'm not going to go into them in any detail. We would be liberators and not occupiers. We would be met with roses and sweets. Extremism, jihadism, and terrorism would be vanquished. Weapons of mass destruction would vanish from the region. The war would be brief, neat, short, and cheap, and perhaps the first self-financing occupation in history. What sort of Iraq would emerge from the ashes of Saddam regime was not a major topic of our domestic debate prior to the invasion. The object was regime change, not nation building. We assumed an intact bureaucracy, a redeemable army, absent the Ba'ath Party and the Revolutionary Guard. We had an unabashed belief in the concept of imposed democracy. The successor regime would be stable, unitary, and friendly. And while democracy was by no means the lead rationale for going into the war, as all the other reasons and rationales have fallen by the wayside, it is the last one standing. Iraq, we were told, would become a beacon of democracy. We would redraw the political map of the region, set history on a new course on our timetable, our vision, and with our people. We would create a new Middle East to match our national values and our strategic goals. My grandmother always told me to be very careful what I wish for. I might get it. We have redrawn the political map of the Middle East, and we have set history on a new course. The hubris that we could control, dictate, and determine that new course and the shape of those new maps has been both our tragedy and Iraq's. After almost 5 years, an occupation that was supposed to last for only 4 months and not be an occupation at all has left an Iraq that is not stable, not unified, and not friendly. Our friends in the region are more embattled and less secure than they were 5 years ago. Our enemies are stronger, and our status, influence, and options globally have diminished. We remain a superpower, but we are not a global power. This is not a failure of imagination. Unlike 9/11, Iraq was not a failure of imagination. It would not have taken a great deal of imagination to anticipate what we could and should expect. We had the detailed planning of the Future of Iraq project, the work of RAND, the Army War College, and many others. There was extensive public testimony by scholars and practitioners before the Senate in August of 2002. There's a body of literature on military occupations, a body of writing on the history of Iraq. And beyond all the experience, the domestic and international, on post-conflict reconstruction, beyond all of that, even if you dismiss that, there was just common sense. Let me pause and introduce two friends, both Greek, who share the stage this afternoon, for they both give a lot of shape to this story. On the one hand, I have the seer Cassandra, cursed by the god Apollo, a jilted lover, cursed that her prophecies, though true, were fated never to be believed. They simply would not listen to her. On the other hand, I have Pandora, the first woman created, endowed by the gods, them again, with all the graces, but given a jar or a box wherein were confined all the evils and the miseries that could trouble humanity. Pandora, being only human, was only curious, and despite what she was told, didn't listen, and opened the box, and all the miseries escaped. Misery requires neither malice nor benevolence. It just did not listen. As Iraq began to unravel, and it began to unravel very early, its architects claimed they had not foreseen, could not have foreseen, were not told or warned of the dangers or the miseries ahead. They simply weren't listening. Cassandra, history, was there in many guises and in many voices. But as one of them told me, we're smarter than history. What lessons and what prophecies did they choose to ignore? First, Iraq's near past, that we would be liberators, but perhaps only briefly. A reading of 20th century Iraqi history tells us that if liberators at all, it would be very brief. Not only the British experience after World War I, but so too the Iran-Iraq War. And I had a front row seat to that war for 3 years. Those of us who were posted in Baghdad during the opening days of the war watched the Iraqi army beat a very hasty and rather undignified retreat from Arabistan or Kazakhstan, depending what side of the border you're on, once the Iranian army regrouped and went on the offensive. However, when the Iranians pushed the Iraqis to the border, primarily along the Shatt al-Arab down by Basra, the Iraqis stood and fought, and what ensued was 6 years of some of the most gruesome trench warfare of the 20th century. The Iraqis did not battle the Iranians to a draw out of love or even out of fear of Saddam. Whatever they thought of him and his family and his friends, and none of it was very good, the prospect of a foreign force, even an Islamic one, occupying Iraq was untenable. Much like their hasty retreat out of Kuwait, mass surrenders during Desert Storm, they did not seem to have a strong predilection to die on someone else in someone else's country, or be sacrificed on the altar of someone else's overwhelming force. Extrapolating for those examples should not have been that difficult. Would the Iraqi army stand and fight? Probably not. Would the Iraqi people welcome foreign occupation? Probably not. Lesson 2, the specter of the second betrayal. An Iraqi exile working in ORHA, the Office of Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance, not a large whale, the precursor to CPA, warned the ORHA leadership that the best we could expect would be cautious wariness, that the Iraqis would wait and see what the nature of the liberation or occupation would be and wait for a clear sense of our motives and our intentions. Memories of the 1991 betrayal are still fresh, and they're very fresh in Iraqi minds, Sunni and Kurd as well as Shia. Repeated statements by President Bush and others that we would get out of Iraq as quickly as possible meant to reassure Americans as much as Iraqis, only reinforced Iraqi fears of a second betrayal. The Shia, perhaps most welcoming of the liberation, were also the most wary. The Sunnis, whose surviving middle class and technocrats were gutted during the sanctions, were suspicious of the exiled leadership and imposed democracy. And the Kurds, who had prospered under a U.S. umbrella, would be wary that their autonomy would be abandoned in the name of Iraqi unity or to placate Iraq's neighbors. Our language was perfectly calibrated to achieve the greatest cynicism and the maximum caution. Lesson 3, the art of occupation. I've been asked a number of times what I thought our critical mistake was, the decision that set us on the path of no return, or at least set in process what appears to be now out of control. Where did we lose that cautious wariness? And there's a number of good candidates. On some macro level, it was a decision in January 2003 to vest DOD with the lead on post-conflict reconstruction, which was an unprecedented step. A lead that became a monopoly operating in disregard for the planning and studies on the table, and I'll return to this later. To the Iraqis, I suspect, and a number of Iraqis have confirmed this, it was our decision not to curb the looting. In fact, we trivialized it as a messy byproduct of freedom. What this said to the average Iraqi who witnessed the rampaging mobs ransacking social service government ministries, centers of history, culture, trash, and increasingly private shops and then private homes was that you're not the reason that we're here. We're not here as liberators of the people, but liberators of the assets and of the location. You are afterthoughts and just pawns in a Middle East initiative to bring freedom on our terms and our timeline. To the average Iraqi, we traded in their daily personal freedom for an amorphous freedom that brought not better government, but anarchy, which was a very strange and a very hollow gift. My second day in Baghdad, before Jay Garner arrived, General McKiernan and I met with a group of prominent non-Chalabi Baghdadis. After we had listened to them for 20 minutes give their version of what had been going on, and we listened to almost a cathartic outpouring of their concerns, one of them turned to us and just said very bluntly, when are you going to institute martial law? They were not asking for a return to authoritarianism, but they were asking for clear lines of authority. McKiernan the next day issued the first statement that put us in a position of legal occupation and legal authority in the country. And this was the first time we had ever used the term occupier to describe ourselves. The general understood that in addition to reassuring the Iraqi public, the spiraling lawlessness and the ambiguous authority was more than messy. It was a direct and growing threat to his own soldiers. The Department of Defense rescinded the order immediately. One of my favorite articles, found early on and I still inflict it on my students, is a fascinating study on the criteria and determinants of successful military occupation, or more importantly, why most occupations fail. A critical component is the degree to which the occupied believe the occupation is in their best interest. And in part, this has to be defined as a common threat that only the occupier can address. Very simple example of that would be the Soviet threat to Germany. Beyond the removal of Saddam and his regime, we and the Iraqis have never defined a common shared sense of threat, internal or external. The second element of best interest is the reconstruction of the defeated state. It is not the military defeat or destruction of the enemy that ensures survival of the victor, but the reconstruction, physical and political. It's the creation of a new, non-threatening state in the place of the former regime. The more complex challenge, therefore, is to leave behind an Iraq that is a viable, sustainable state. Whether this can be met through security measures only, or whether this requires complete overhaul of the occupied country's political or economic structure is the question. Iraq began as an anomaly. It was not a humanitarian intervention, a peacekeeping operation, or even a preemptive strike. Iraq War, as conceived and executed, was not an exception to the Bush policy to desist from nation building, but in many ways was its ultimate manifestation. We planned for regime change, but we did not ever admit that we were going to be occupiers, because that would relieve us of the obligations of being an occupier. We had a plan for Baghdad, but we had a plan for the Battle of Baghdad, but we explicitly refused to plan for the day after. And by plan, I mean a coherent, comprehensive strategy reflecting a policy, not just a compilation of tasks and timelines. The decision not to plan, resource, or staff for a post-conflict environment reflected a conviction that there would be no nation in need of rebuilding. And this was based on a stunning contradiction. On the one hand, Iraqi physical and civil infrastructure would be largely intact, as well as the bureaucracy and the personnel, and they would be functioning well enough. Imposed democracy would be a viable political model, and oddly, at the same time, Iraq was an artificial state, and therefore no Iraq, no Iraqi identity, and no Iraqi nation. In other words, we wouldn't have to rebuild Iraq on the one hand because it wouldn't be broken, and on the other hand because it didn't exist. These assumptions drove, that's why I had a headache the whole time I worked on this. These assumptions drove decisions on force strength and structure. The problem was that the mission did not fit the realities on the ground. And the realities on the ground, rather than adjusting our mission, we simply resaw the realities on the ground. We dismissed the looting as a messy byproduct of freedom. We dismissed the insurgency as dead-enders or the meddling of neighbors. Was inadequate troop strength a planning error in Tampa or a decision in the Pentagon? If the decision to liberate with minimal force was a political decision rather than a military decision, a decision that we would do regime change and not nation building, and that the two of them could be separated, then we were simply negligent. Lesson 4, it's the politics, stupid. All due respect to Mr. Carville. One astute observer of Iraq described the security situation as follows. The reborn Iraqi polity has been marked by escalating violence embodied in a homegrown insurgency, rampant crime in an environment of endemic lawlessness, an ongoing alien military occupation, the flowering of militias linked to political parties, and the emergence of Iraqi security forces that remain weak, lack discipline, and are prone to violating human rights. The monopoly over violence, in other words, has become diffuse, and this vastly complicates the task of state building, which additionally has to accommodate the rise in religiosity and Islamic activism. This description, by the way, is 2 years old. It is not a new problem. It is only one that we recently are addressing directly. Conventionalism for a very long time dictated that security had to be our first priority, and that this was the key determinant of our policy and our approach, and that therefore victory would be our objective. And it is difficult to imagine a government absent an acceptable level of security and stability and provided by the state. Basic function of any state is to provide a reasonable measure of personal and communal security, and therefore, before any talk about legitimacy, you do have to talk about security. Security also has the advantage that it can be measured. How many troops have been trained, to what level of competence, to what ratio to U.S. troops, how many neighborhoods have been cleared out. If you shoot enough of the bad guys, put enough forces and boots on the ground in the neighborhood, round up enough of the usual suspects, the problem will ultimately go away. But security and stability as ends in themselves are short-term, relative, and potentially counterproductive. Security is not a sufficient measure of occupation success. To ensure an occupying power's political and strategic interest well beyond the end of the occupation has to be the goal. Many of the presumptions and resulting policies of the U.S. administration going into Iraq exacerbated the divisions in Iraqi society. We did not create them, but the lines were drawn far more emphatically. The Iraqi need to defragment is therefore in part an effort to reverse the impact of U.S. policies. The fragmentation in many ways reflects the belief and the concern that there is not yet a structure that can and will provide protection to all Iraqis. And without this belief in security, justice, and fairness, there can be no sense of a legitimate state that will defend or deserves to be defended. The state, in other words, simply remains other. The issue, therefore, is not the size of the Iraqi military or the police force. The issue is the legitimacy, not the legality, but the legitimacy of the Iraqi government. An army or a police absent a legitimate state is simply a house of cards, a very hollow structure. What legitimacy is and what it is not. What legitimacy is not is a predetermined set of events and entities that check off the box called democracy. It is not elections, it is not a written constitution or a parliament, at least not those in and of themselves. Those are the hallmarks of a legitimate government if they reflect the social contract between the rulers, the government, and the ruled, the citizens. As any number of Iraqis have pointed out, under Saddam, they had elections, a parliament, and a constitution. Legitimacy has been described as when the articulate members of a population are by and large satisfied with the government's actions in the areas of identity, participation, distribution, equality, and sovereignty according to the norms they believe in. Legitimacy includes accountability, transparency, participation, equality, and rule of law, with rule of law perhaps being the first among equals. Rule of law reflects, enshrines, enables, and guarantees all the other elements of legitimacy. If security is the capacity to impose, maintain, and enforce order, legitimacy is the capacity to create compliance. Legitimacy explains why rules and rulers are accepted without having to be constantly coerced. Police authority comes from the acceptance that the rules they enforce are legitimate and are enforced fairly and equitably. Conversely, the perception of the ruled, if the perception of the ruled is the police or the army reflect and enforce a structure and a process that is not fair or equitable, that is loyal first to person, sect, or ethnic group, then the compliance has to be enforced. If a state is in control, as it was under Saddam, you can enforce compliance through fear. In a fractured society, you end up with parallel security structures such as militias. Another outcome of legitimacy is outcome, and this is the provision of services in a fair, equitable manner. The converse is corruption and cronyism. And unfortunately, to date, I would say that both the U.S. occupation and the series of interim and the now elected government have manifestly failed the legitimacy tests on both counts as well as the security test. Lesson 5, corollary to the lessons of occupation are lessons of counterinsurgency. Basic maxim of counterinsurgency is that you can never win militarily. You can lose militarily, but you're not going to win. Counterinsurgency, communal violence, civil wars are political, and that is where they are won, fought, and lost. The difference between short-term security and long-term success is reflected in the U.S. Army Field Manual, Counterinsurgency Operations, which, believe it or not, you can buy that at Borders. And it recognizes the importance of legitimacy. Legitimacy, unlike security, can't be taught, it can't be conferred, it can't be imposed, it can't be quantified, but it can be encouraged, supported, and fostered. There can be the recognition of the need to fairly and equitably provide services through the training of technocrats and the provision of a civil service. The need for rule of law is not just a police force, but a judiciary and the rest of the entire judicial system. Rule of law has been described as the most critical factor in the return to the sense of normalcy. The recognition of the need for accountability and transparency, public integrity, tough anti-corruption legislation, a visible and independent press, and also in the form of how the rulemaking is done. And participation can be supported through civil society, not just elections. Lesson 6, soft partition is a form of soft bigotry of low expectations. Some observers explicitly discount legitimacy as a viable criteria in Iraq. They dismiss the notion of a credible governing structure in the near term in Iraq, at least anything that approximates our notions of a liberal democracy. They argue that Iraq is inherently violent, irreparably divisive, eternally undemocratic, if not simply ungovernable. And the whole point is just to stop the chaos and stop the carnage. And whether that means the reinstallation of an authoritarian government, a kind of a Saddam light, or such a loose confederation that the state essentially ceases to exist, doesn't really matter. And if the Iraqis cannot do it or will not do it, then we will do it for them, and we call it a surge. But I think it's a disservice to believe the Iraqis can aspire to no more than a benign but strong leader. They can expect a government that's credible, national, and legitimate, and at least is in the evolutionary stages through an Iraqi-style good governance. I think that that is reasonable. It is equally a denial of history to contend that there is no Iraq, that it's an artificial state, and that the greatest kindness would be to simply put it out of its misery, if not just encourage it to do so. The Baker-Hamilton report makes clear that de facto, much less de jure partition, what David Brooks calls soft partition, along ethnic and sectarian lines is unnecessary, unworkable, impractical, and unsupportable. First of all, Iraq doesn't divide into three neat parts. One of the greatest disservices that we did to ourselves and to the Iraqis is that we had these maps all over the walls in Orha, where there was a green blip in the bottom that said Shia, an orange blip in the middle that said Sunni, and a green blip in the north that said Kurd. And they were monolithic and they were homogeneous. And in a way we compounded this with what I call a perversion of Garrison Keillor, that all the Shia were good, all the Sunnis were culpable, and all the Kurds were small d Democrats. As a result, we overpromised the Shia, resulting in frustration. We marginalized the Sunnis, which led to resentment at least, and we misled the Kurds, which I think will haunt us in them for years. Iraq, for centuries, if not millennia, has been a mosaic of 27 different ethnic and sectarian groups. Most tribes and major ethnic groups are mixed and intermarried. Baghdad, which accounts for over 25% of Iraq's total population, is a mix even more pronounced. And even with the neighborhood cleansings and even with the population transfers, it is still predominantly mixed neighborhoods and a mixed mosaic country. If you did divide it into three parts, you would end up with significant minorities within each of those parts. And like Russian dolls, you would have a complete shattering of the state as you went down and down until you found the pure enclaves for each of the 27 groups. Partitions historically do not resolve conflicts. They generally exacerbate them. Governmental partition is no better than geographic partition, and one of the first things that I heard from any number of Iraqis when I first went there is, please, whatever you do, don't Lebanize us. What exactly did we do to their governmental structure? We Lebanized it. And I also don't accept the assumption that there is no Iraqi identity. Iraq is not, specious analogies to the contrary, Yugoslavia. It is not a collection of medieval fiefdoms, and it does not have a history of communal violence or civil wars. There were sectarian differences. There were not sectarian debates and battles as there are now. The core of Iraq, the belt of population that runs from Basra through Mosul, has existed for millennia. And however artificial, even if you accept the fact that it is an artificial state, with the lines drawn 80 years ago or so, 80 years ago is long enough to forge a national identity. There are any number of states in the world today that are far less than 80 years old, whose identity are not questioned by either its own population or by the outside world. We'll start with India. None of the major groups can defeat each other militarily. Each of them can wreak havoc on the others. They all need each other economically. Geographic partition is impractical, and a hollowed-out national government settled with federalism run amok will not work. They still have an unworkable resource allocation plan, and they have a problem with militias posing as an army. They have every reason to begin to compromise. The Kurds' cockiness of 15 years has been tempered by the vortex of a failed state to the south, a very impatient Turkey to the north, and the specter of having to trade some of their sovereignty for survival. Shia majoritarianism is as untenable to the Kurds as Baathism was. The Shia arrogance of an overpromise of compensatory power and wealth has twisted into a fear of a second American betrayal. And if they lose us, they know they've lost again. And the Sunnis read of American policy of concerted marginalization swings now to dreams of regained glory as Iran, America's only bulwark against Iran. So much for the lessons of history. Pandora's box. Have we fared any better regionally if Iraq has really not been doing so well? Unfortunately, Our policies and our progress in the region have in many ways mirrored that of Iraq. The war on terrorism, the core organization remains, and Iraq is a training ground and a major recruiting tool. Democratization was ongoing and indigenous, and has probably stalled in the last several years, not been able to move forward. We have proved far less tolerant of the process of democratization and its ambiguities and uncertainties in the last few years, our unambiguous statements of support for democracy notwithstanding. Our politics and rhetoric have fueled the Iranian drive for a nuclear capacity, and the war on terrorism has not only allowed but in some cases encouraged a walking back from human rights, rule of law, by insisting on Patriot Act-like legislation without reference to safeguards and protections. To a far greater or lesser degree, we have repeated a lot of the mistakes of Iraq. There's been an over-reliance on force and an under-emphasis on diplomacy. There's been an inability or an unwillingness to learn from realities as they shifted. We mistook the capacity to act with the power to influence, and we mistook hard power for soft power. We say we have a war of ideas, but we respond in an ideological rather than an ideas-based manner. And we expropriated democracy as a force of coercive diplomacy. Probably most dangerous of all is that we have unleashed the genie to Americans of sectarianism. We have recast the debate, the discussions, and the power struggles in wholly sectarian terms. Like Pandora's box, it's virtually impossible to get the evils back in the box. But like Pandora's box, I do think that hope remains. I do not think we have irretrievably squandered our good name and our influence or our role, but we need to make some fundamental changes. Within Iraq, we need to move from a discussion of withdrawal to a discussion of transition. We need to cease our role as enablers of the political process. I think our new ambassador has done a very good job in trying to shift the debate from one of proactive, highly publicly participatory, which I think was a major mistake, to very proactive but discreetly participatory. We need to stop withholding or granting endorsement of key political leaders as if Iraq were a puppet state and deal with, to borrow a phrase from another man, deal with the Iraqi government we have, not with the Iraqi government that we want. We need to support the process and stay away from the provisions. And in that sense, I talk primarily about changes to the Constitution and other domestic legislation. We need to work with the provinces but speak to the center. We can identify and work with the centripetal forces that have held the country together despite 5 years of battering, rather than playing to the centrifugal forces that pull it apart. The Iraqis can and do manage multiple identities, and we need to identify those that hold the country together, not play to those that pull it apart. We need to internationalize the transition and regionalize the dialogue, and I think the Baker Report made this about as strong as anyone. It is not whether or not we have a common vision for a long-term Iraq, but we certainly have shared short-term needs. We need to talk to the region. We have proven we cannot do this ourselves. We need to bring the region, and that's all of it, into the discussion. We need to change our approach in the region, and we need to get ahead of the crisis curve. Our policy in the region has been much more negative-based. We have been focusing on a reactive, not a creative approach. And as I said, a negative interest-based policy, what we don't want, who we don't like, and what we cannot tolerate. We spend more time and money and effort on trying to destabilize regimes we don't like and not enough on building civil society, political institutions, and supporting productive and constructive forces that we do. We look small and peevish. The positive goals remain feasible. Extremism and terrorism have very few supporters in the region. It is a threat to everyone. We can work on this. Non-proliferation is something that almost everyone in the region supports. We can work on this. Democratization or good governance is a debate, is an ongoing debate within the government and the government in the region, and we need to become a partner in this. I trust we have a learning curve. I do believe that we can learn to calibrate military and diplomacy, and that we can calibrate hard and soft power, that we can again embrace multipolarity and middle powers as our friends. We can accept that there can and will be Islamic, if not Islamist, legitimate political parties, governments, and states. We can learn that threatening to isolate and make ultimatums of with us or against us can leave us very much alone. We can learn that between draconian regime change and long-term nation building is what Richard Haas calls regime evolution, which is the very essence of diplomacy. And we can realign resources to fit missions. In other words, we need to demilitarize our foreign policy. I said I would get back to this, and I would say that if regionally the major legacy is sectarianism in the region, domestically it is the militarization of our foreign policy. When DoD was designated the lead agency in January 2003, state, USAID, and the rest of the executive branch were marginalized. NGOs could not get a hearing. The UN was not allowed to play except most reluctant manner and only as an instrument of our policies. And the military was mandated to absorb functions of these organizations and agencies. This is a mistake. The military, with its manpower, logistical capacity, and resources, dwarf any civilian agency. There are over 200 times more people in the National Guard than there is in the Foreign Service. There's more U.S. military in Mississippi than there is in the Foreign Service. And I don't think we're still an occupying force in Mississippi, are we? No, okay. They dwarf us in numbers and size and budget. But they're being tasked with roles and missions for which they are not prepared, and wheels are being reinvented everywhere and not always well. The imbalance between DoD and the rest of the U.S. government was described by one person at one conference as one government agency on steroids and the rest on life support. We're now on the tip of a vicious cycle whereby as civilian agencies atrophy and lose the capacity to carry out their operational mandates, the military is being tasked to take up the slack. We need to realign from the presumption that the military will be the lead in all things. How we structure ourselves to meet the probability of continued interstate violence, humanitarian disasters, transnational threats, we need to look at them holistically. And we need to structure ourselves and resource ourselves and deal with the external world in a way that is holistic. I was talking with some cadets from West Point last week, and as I explained to them, you wouldn't have an army made up entirely of tanks. You wouldn't have a military made up entirely of the army. We should not be dealing with our foreign policy, including humanitarian intervention and other foreign policy and post-conflict, with only one tool, the military. A more robust approach to peacekeeping and nation building is desperately needed, but that cannot be a code for the militarization of nation building. The military should be, to use a military parlance, the supporting command, with the civilian agencies and international organizations the supported command. We ad hoc'd our way into Baghdad 5 years ago. We were more convinced by our own ideology than the lessons of history or the expertise of our own people. We happy talked our way in, and somehow if we didn't plan for a problem, it wouldn't happen. We not only didn't have an exit strategy, we didn't really even have an entrance strategy. We have to leave, and we should want to leave. The question is not if, but how. A commitment to support and encourage the evolution of a viable state, a process that is evident and credible to the Iraqis, and will be resourced adequately over the long term, is needed to create the environment within which the political accommodations necessary to address the root causes can be used to defeat, if not destroy, this enemy. We should not and cannot leave the same way we came in. Unplanned, unresourced, unilateral, on our timeline and our political agenda. We owe it to the Iraqis and to ourselves, and to our men and women, civilian and military, governmental and non-governmental, who have already sacrificed so much and deserve so much better. Thank you. Anyone have any comments on things having to do with Iraq? Yes. You're going to have, okay. Do you want to do this part?
Sure.
And you're going to, unfortunately, we don't have a walking mic, so you're going to have to kind of shout, and I will try to rephrase your question.
Get ready. I have a comment and a question. My comment is that the problem with the Middle East, like past in this great case, that what do you do when people don't want to listen to you? For example, even in academia, very often people don't want to listen to my questions, and perhaps some other people's questions, but that's not even politics. And that's just human nature. And that's the past 6 or 7 years with the Israeli-Palestinian case, where people don't want to listen to you. Military force, torturing them, or talking to death, with some third world loans that they're never going to give back to us, by to the World Bank, and the EU is not giving any more money to the World Bank because they can't enforce the rules, for the loans. I mean, just very little you can do. That's my comment. My question is about Iraq war. Doris Fox, thinking about, I was against what many Democrats I thought were a little bit chicken, but hearing what you said, I changed my mind. And my question is the following. Thinking about it, perhaps we need somebody like Mr. Hussein who's cruel and petty to control the civil war issues in Iraq, because there wasn't as much of a civil war because he was cruel and petty and executed people. Well, we executed him. Now the question is that can Iraq be controlled by a Democratic army, like our Democratic army under Abraham Lincoln controlled and quelled with massive death of the American racial civil war. Of course, religious civil war involves much more hatred.
Okay, I think I understand the basic question. On the issue of listening, to be honest, not everyone is ever going to listen to everything you have to say. We all wish they would. They don't. If the world had listened to me for the last 34 years and listened to you, we would have none of the foreign policy problems we have. And if you read most autobiographies, they're basically in terms of if they had listened to me, for the last fill in the blank, everything would be fine. I think the problem with Iraq is that we had a far more systemic problem of information, debate, discussion within the national security making process shutting down during the whole run-up to the war. I think for both of us and anyone who's been in the government, one of your jobs was to bring to the policymaker as much information on the cost, the benefit, the consequences of various courses of action. So at least they had the full range of what they were deciding amongst. And there was an open and free debate and discussion on these things. What I saw on Iraq is that there was no debate. The decision had been made. New information coming in was just shut down. And if you brought up inconvenient truths, you were fired, you were marginalized. It was very much of an echo chamber. And there were a lot of people who were trying to get information on probable day after scenarios, and they didn't fit with the ideology. You are never going to be listened to as much as you like, but in this case we had a systemic shutdown of the transmission and debate and consideration of information. And as a result, as I said, almost everything that happened was not only predictable, but was predicted. Is the only thing that can save Iraq is a new kind of Saddam? No, I don't accept that. They have had a very rocky history, but I don't think any state or people deserves or can only aspire to something like a Saddam to hold them together. I think that on one level, and I know you don't mean it this way, but it's almost insulting to say that they cannot aspire to or manage a government that is at least accountable, transparent, operates on rule of law, operates on some form of participation, whether or not it looks like what we all got from our high school civic classes on what, quote, democracy is, to me is irrelevant. But open, transparent, fair, and rule of law is something I think any society can aspire to, that any society has the capacity for. Certainly the Iraqis can as well. Is it going to take some kind of a strong personality, a true leader? Yes, absolutely. Non-leadership generally can't do these things. But does strong leader need to mean an authoritarian dictator who operates outside all the other bounds? No. We were blessed with a very strong leader when we were putting our country together. George Washington, guy who crossed the river over here. You can have a strong leader. You need a strong leader, but he doesn't, and he can be an authority figure, but he doesn't need to be an authoritarian figure. And I think that that is a fair thing to both hope for the Iraqis, for them to aspire to, and I think it's a fair standard for any nation state.
Back in lesson 1, you said that America's enemies have become stronger. Which enemies and by what metric?
I would say that one of our favorite enemies, and I think that we've maybe demonized them a little, but let's just say the Iranians have benefited tremendously from what we have done in the region. We've eliminated 2 of their major problems, Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein. And they are probably more influential than they were prior to the invasion. I don't think that they are as much of a threat as the current administration would like you to believe. There are enormous internal problems in Iran, primarily economic, and a very complex governing structure. So they're not quite the demon we make them out to be. But I think that if you take a look at the kind of threats we said we were going to be vanquishing, we really didn't do a very, very good job. We are, interestingly, we are very concerned about Iran's role in Iraq, yet the government that we support is a Shia-based government that spent most of its exile in Iran, and we're somehow surprised that these people continue to have a relationship with Iran. And there's just parts of some of the elements, and someone told me that 22 out of 24 of the Afghan cabinet spent their exile in Iran. A figure something like that. That doesn't sound right to you. Okay. It was a great factoid. Unfortunately wrong. But I think, we've lost a lot of our credibility in the region. We've lost our ability to influence as opposed to just coerce. And I think that something like that is always going to strengthen those who are opposed to us, as opposed to, I think we had a better position in the region than we do now, overall.
You didn't mention anything about oil. Where does that fit into the equation?
It's high. I know, it's odd. I don't think that oil was one of the motivating factors going into Iraq. I know that Mr. Greenspan thinks it was, but I think it was much more this transformational, imposed democracy, restructuring the Middle East. There was a different game that was being played. Saddam Hussein was not a threat to oil supplies. He was not a threat to the price of oil. I mean, look at the price of oil from beginning the war till after the war. We didn't really do very much about securing the oil fields. We didn't even stop at the oil fields. We went straight past the oil fields. We assumed a government that was going to continue to pump oil, but that oil was already on the market. Saddam's ability to take either his oil off the market, he wasn't going to do that. He needed the money. His ability to threaten the oil in the region, he had already tried that once with Kuwait, didn't work. Tried it with Iran, didn't work. So I don't think that a good argument can be made that oil was a primary motivating factor going in. And I still don't think it really kind of shapes our policy there. I almost wish that we had something that more pragmatic that was driving it. We might have had more pragmatic policies. but we really didn't. It's curious. When we went in Bosphor, we went straight up the river to Baghdad. We didn't even stop at the oil fields. We didn't even secure the oil fields. We just kept going. We secured the oil ministry, not the oil fields.
Just a historical point. Was not the reconstruction of Japan under the military?
The reconstruction of Japan and Germany both started off under the military. But during World War II, as you remember, almost every able man was in the military. You had a full mobilization. But I know Germany a little bit better. The planning for the reconstruction started years before. It was based at universities where people learned the language, the history, the culture. It was completely planned out. It started off as military occupations. Again, we had a complete defeat, military defeat of an enemy as well. Transitioned very quickly to civilian occupation management. It started off as military. It transitioned very quickly, and the military element of it was as much a reflection of the mobilization during World War II as it was who was actually making the decisions. This was one where the civilian agencies were completely excluded, dramatically excluded. And you had military people who were not trained in the language, in post-conflict, in the region, or anything else. You had guys who, and I knew a lot of these Army captains, these were kids, you know, who had fought their way up to Baghdad. They were trained war fighters. That's what they were supposed to do. That was their mission, goal, and training in life. And suddenly they're given Dora neighborhood in Baghdad with the major power plant to reconstruct, to try to figure out how to do village councils, to try to figure out how to do traffic. It wasn't necessarily the element of who was, you know, whether it was a uniform or not, but what was the training behind this. And these people were war fighters, not reconstruction. The reconstruction people weren't allowed in at all.
Ambassador Bodine, in the run-up to the war, I have a two-part question. In the run-up to the war, there was a premise that Saddam Hussein was looking for the yellow cake from Niger, and it turned out that that was based on forged documents given by an international intelligence agency to the Italians.
Right.
Turned it over. Why was there no international investigation to hold the source of those forged documents, find out who the source was, and hold that international agency accountable? That's my first question. My second question is, in the war on terror, it's being fueled in large part by drug profits coming out of Afghanistan. The heroin supply has quadrupled after we got rid of the Taliban. Why is this being allowed by our policymakers?
The yellow cake story is, I think, you know, one of the elements of that is that almost everyone who saw those documents early on said that they were forgeries. And I think we all know that we sent one of our colleagues out to reconfirm that. When you're overseas and in diplomacy and working with intelligence, it's sometimes rather remarkable, you know, what kind of really crummy forgeries of the most remarkable quality that you get. And tracing them back sometimes all the way back to their sources is very difficult. Once they've been discredited, and I think that this was one of the problems with the yellow cake story, what was remarkable about that was, even though the documents had been discredited and we had gone to Niger and confirmed that there's just no truth to this, that the story wouldn't go away. Lots of weird things show up. They don't normally have that kind of life expectancy. And I think what's disturbing about the yellow cake story is what it says about how intelligence was cherry-picked, the way that they looked for the intelligence that reaffirmed what they wanted to say, as opposed to said what the intelligence confirmed. And I think that's the major issue. I mean, you had that across the board on the intelligence. You had it on the drones. You had it on the aluminum tubes. You had it on almost everything. And it was the kind of the inability to get these stories to go away once they had been refuted, which is really, I think, the issue on that. On the drugs, a lot of things fuel terrorism. One of the truly unfortunate elements of terrorism is very cheap. It's very, very cheap to do most terrorism. You don't need major laundering organizations. You don't. I think the IRA used to support itself by knocking over 7-Elevens. It doesn't need to be a great big fancy Dr. No kind of scheme. The heroin production, you probably know more about that than I do in Afghanistan.
Well, yeah, I'd go back to the Fez poem. The boatmen were unskilled and the oars had not been tested. And unfortunately, from the beginning, the problem of Afghanistan has been too few people, too little money, and you find that in all these areas. And it was very much the case with the drug eradication, which was regionally given to the British. And amazingly, little money was contributed from anyone else, including all of Europe, the people who are the customers of the Afghan drug market. And our military was not there in sufficient quantity to deal with drugs. It was, number 14 on their to-do list, and they said, we were still working on number 1, and we're still working on number 1. So all of these things, and we come down to today where we are trying to implement a program which is essentially a recapitulation of the program that was done in Colombia, which has failed in Colombia. So, we don't necessarily learn from our mistakes. And meanwhile, of course, the drug market has grown to be more than 100% of the world's supply. Yeah, sadly.
Thank you.
Sir.
He's doing it, not me. No, go ahead.
You mentioned that the Iraqi government has failed a lot of measures of legitimacy. Presumably, if we focus more on governance rather than democratization when we went in, maybe that would have been a different situation. But now that the government has been democratized, I hear a lot of American politicians saying how the government is theirs, and what happens with the government now over there is up to them. Is that true? Are we past the point of being able to lend any legitimacy to their government, or beyond security measures? Is there anything the U.S. can do to help legitimize that government, or that any friendly regional actors can do to help legitimize it?
Yeah, it's very hard for someone else to confer legitimacy on a government. You can recognize a government, but it's very hard for someone else to legitimize it. I think we did a number of things to delegitimize the Iraqi government. Passing public judgment on their leadership. Even when Maliki was finally chosen, the president getting on the plane, flying straight to Iraq, without telling the president of Iraq that he was coming, and the president wouldn't fly into California without telling Schwarzenegger he was coming, but, we can fly into Iraq. And that, he's my man, he's good, we start getting into passing those judgments. We've already delegitimized them in that sense. But for them to really develop legitimacy in the eyes of their own people, that is something that really only they can create. We can help in the sense of, again, trying to establish a more normal political relationship and less one of looking like a dependency. An Iraqi friend of mine once said, could you just kind of pretend we're a sovereign state when you talk to us? Just fake it a little bit and we would feel better. But in a sense, he's from Chicago, but what he was really saying is, could you treat us with dignity? Could you treat us with respect? Could you treat us like a sovereign state? And we don't do that. We still treat them as if we can micromanage what their legislation is, that we can decide, what they should be doing. We can decide what their oil law should look like. And yes, part of diplomacy is going in and talking to governments about, we kind of wish you should do this. We think this would be better. but it's a question of doing it discreetly as opposed to standing outside and second-guessing them constantly. I think the Biden amendment, the Biden bill the other day we think that they should devolve more authority to their federal regions, was the most egregious, patronizing, delegitimizing of their government I had ever seen. It's none of our business. First of all, I think that the idea is completely wrong. But it was also, it would be like, the British government passing a bill in Parliament in 1860, telling Abraham Lincoln, we really think you ought to let the South go. And I reacted. I think, I know, and it took us a long time. We didn't like it very much, did we? We passed the Emancipation Proclamation to get them to stop doing stuff like that. We can provide training to help, for capacity building, things like judiciary, things like civil service. We are kind of pushing states to establish embassies, which on a certain level, adds some legitimacy, but, not really. Most of these countries had embassies when Saddam was there. So we kind of have this idea that having an embassy legitimizes or delegitimizes, and it doesn't really. I think the basic thing that we can do is to try to push the idea that they need to create a legitimate state in the eyes of their own people, and that means trying to create more of a national government. It should be less trying to please us, and we put it in those terms. What are they doing for us? We should be putting it more in terms of what are they doing to reach out to their own people. Provide the services, provide the security, provide the sense of national identity. I think there has been some efforts toward that. I think we were far more delegitimizing before Ambassador Crocker got there, but we still need to take some steps, and we need a Congress that spends less time micromanaging how other people organize their affairs and maybe more time passing their own budget bills.
You mentioned an over-reliance on security, and it made me think that in Germany, after World War II, we had 1 million troops there for 5 years, and that was a kind of security which was so obvious because of the numbers. We have very few numbers of troops in Iraq, and they can't really provide security. So don't you think that some form of security is necessary for the Iraqi government to come together and to grow?
Well, that brings up the question of whether or not we had enough troops going in. And there's really kind of a whole series of debates you can have about Iraq. One of them is, what were the reasons for going in and were they legitimate? Another one, did we go in militarily with enough troops? And then the third one is obviously, did we plan and how we conducted ourselves the day after? We did not go in with enough troops to secure the country. And it would not have taken a lot. But, it's interesting. You go back and you look at not just what General Shinseki was saying and General Zinni was saying, but I reread Ken Pollock's article that is generally seen as one of the real supporters of going in. And even he said 200 to 300,000 troops. So we've always gone in with too few troops. And I think if we could have gone in and provided the basic security, I think we did by not stopping the looting. We allowed a lawlessness to catch fire, and we delegitimized ourselves in the eyes of the Iraqis as to what we were doing. At this point, it is probably too late. I mean, we could send in 500,000, or if we really even have 500,000 troops, we sent them in. The nature of the violence now is out of our control. The nature of the violence now can only be brought under control really by the Iraqis. But we did let it slip in the beginning. There was an interesting comment by one Iraqi at the time of the January 05 elections, which, as we remember, went off without any major security incident because we imposed a curfew, We shut down car traffic. We were checking cars. There was an incredible security clampdown. And one Iraqi said, you know, it would have been nice if you had done this during the first 3 days that you were in Baghdad. If you could do it then, why didn't you do it now? It's really not a question of the number of troops. It was what mission and mandate they were given. And they were not given the mission and mandate to do this. We could have. At that point, we could have created enough stability that I think a government could have begun to emerge. But the other step that we did, in addition, and this goes to your legitimacy issue, is that the deal that we had really struck with a lot of, if you want, the centrist national Iraqis, was that there would be a gradual turnover of sovereignty starting almost immediately. Now, at one end you had the, we're going to give it all to Chalabi within 3 months and get out of town quickly. And that, I think, would have been a huge mistake. But then we went the entire other direction, and we ended up with a viceroy for a year. And the Iraqis were never brought in at all. They were denied almost all access, all involvement, all role in the governing. And so that as much created this vacuum. And then, a third point is, and we kind of forget this, that when we did the demobilization and debothification, which are, stunningly, catastrophically bad decisions, in the debothification, there is in there, and you can never have any other job in the government. What we did is that we kind of removed an entire pool of people who are not only the technocrats that you need to run the country, but could have been the Sunni leaders to be brought into the governing, not just the managing of the country. And we took all of those people out of the mix.
And just parenthetically, and that's not what we did in Germany and Japan. We
Right.
used the people who were there.
Yeah.
Just as a follow-up question, Ambassador, to what extent are you concerned about the prospect of really hasty withdrawal, especially the Democratic president in 2006?
Yeah. As I said, I hope that we don't leave the same way we went in. That would, and even those in the region, and even among Iraqis who had real concerns about our going in, and certainly had concerns about the way we went in, don't want us to leave immediately. The idea that we could even leave in 120 or 180 days, I think, shows a lack of understanding about how complex our presence is. That would be as disastrous as staying. And if you look at the intelligence reports in the Baker-Hamilton, they all talk about the problem of a precipitous withdrawal. And I agree, a precipitous, unilateral, unplanned, unresourced, exiting the same way we came in would be a catastrophe. I do think that a timeline with benchmarks for us, as much as for the Iraqis, that we are going to do this phased withdrawal. And it gives us benchmarks. To be perfectly honest, when we talk about, we've been in Korea for X number of decades, we've been in Germany X number of decades, people stop planning. They don't think about how are we going to get out. They also don't realize that the nature of our presence in all those countries changed considerably from what they were at the immediate end of hostilities to what they are today. We need to tell ourselves that in 18 months, our major military presence is going to be out. We will have transitioned, not a withdrawal, but a transition to a more normal political relationship. The status of the troops is going to be, in some ways, more analogous to what they might have been in Germany and Japan in, let's say the 60s, than they were in Germany and Japan in the 40s. And we're going to give ourselves these kinds of timelines and stay with them. Because I'm afraid that if we don't do that, at a certain point, there will be, finally the American public will say enough, something will happen, and everyone will say enough, and the drive will be it'll be the last episode of MASH, with everyone just packing everything up and going, and that would be wrong. Let's do ourselves a favor and plan for an orderly withdrawal and an orderly transition, not a withdrawal of all of our troops, but a transition of their status and their function a transition of the nature of our relationship with the Iraqi government, and do it right. And I think we should be able to do that.
Does the withdrawal make any sense at all if the government is so ineffective? I mean, even a phased withdrawal, telegraphing a timeline, giving the opposition that lies in wait the opportunity to plan along our timeline to create more havoc.
Well, I'm not sure that staying is going to make a difference. It's maybe one of the ways I would turn it around. In a sense, our presence is almost enabling.
We stayed 40,000 troops in North Korea, and that helped a lot for 50 years.
In North Korea?
I mean, South Korea, excuse me.
But we weren't, we didn't have the same relationship with the government that you're talking about us having in Iraq. You didn't have a civil war going on in South Korea. We were there because of the North Koreans, not because of the South Koreans. Same way we were in Germany because of the Soviets, not because of the Germans. And in all of those countries, we transitioned to a fairly normal political and economic and diplomatic relationship with all of those countries fairly early on. The occupying troops in South Korea, in South Korea, did not operate as an occupying force in the terms of trying to run the country and police the country and everything else, the way that we're trying to do in Iraq. I mean, we turned this over to a sovereign Korean government, German government, Japanese government fairly early on. I think personally that our staying is not going to bring the Iraqis to the tough decisions they have to make in order to run their own country. I do think that the planned departure of the U.S. will force some of these decisions. If we're staying simply because they are a dysfunctional government, then we're going to have to go to an awful lot of other countries. There's a lot of dysfunctional governments around. And there's a difference between a dysfunctional government and a failed state. And I think the Iraq may very well have a dysfunctional government for a very long time. It took Korea a very long time to become really a full-fledged democracy. That's not the criteria for us staying. I think, again, you're talking about us staying as if we are running the country. We can't run the country. We can't provide the security for them. We can stay as trainers. But we need to balance that with more work on the economic development, the political development, the involvement of the international community, and get to the kind of reconstruction that we were doing in Germany and Japan and Korea and other places in the 50s. Not sort of locking us where we were at the very first days of a true military occupation.
Periodically, money has leaked into our discussion. A few days ago, the New York Times pointed out that in inflation-adjusted dollars, the cost of our reconstruction in Japan was about $18 billion. Mm-hmm. That is dwarfed by the amount of money we have already poured into the Iraq situation. Mm-hmm. Continuing the Pandora's box analogy, where is your hope for the money that will be necessary, and where will it come from?
Yeah, well, if the money going into Iraq was going into reconstruction, that would be one thing, but it's not going into reconstruction. I mean, we spend $1 billion every 8 hours in Iraq. Every 8 hours? I mean, by the time, when you go to sleep and wake up in the night, you've just spent $1 billion. And so the money is not showing up there. It's not having the kind of impact, that it had. I don't really think that, if we actually tried to spend that much money in reconstruction, that anybody could absorb that much. So I don't know, I do think that is another reason that we need to seriously consider the structure, the presence, the operation of our forces in Iraq. and find a way of taking some of that money and actually working with the Iraqis, international organizations, NGOs, and others, and actually trying to figure out how do you rebuild that country. It's not being rebuilt. There is not a sustainable rebuilding going on. And until that happens, it's not going to be a stable country. That money is not reconstruction money. Don't think it is.
I think maybe this should be the last question.
You laid out the characteristics of the Iraqi who might be accepted and be a good leader.
Mm-hmm.
Could you put a name to that?
No.
And then to an American who might be a good leader.
I mean, do it here? No, I mean, I don't, and I wouldn't pretend, and I would say the one thing that we're very, very bad at is picking other people's leaders. I don't know, because sometimes picking our own. But, that's one problem with regime change is that you're then responsible for picking the next leader, and our track record on that is not very good. I don't know who that would be. And I'm not sure that anybody, even in the embassy, would necessarily know who that would be as a particular name. I would say that if I were going to give you the sort of the eHarmony, profile, first of all, it's going to be a he. Well, that's an easy one. Huh? Probably with a mustache. Dark hair, swarthy. My guess is that it's going to be someone who has strong internal rather than exile credentials. I think that's one of the problems is the succession of leaders have all been coming from the exile community, and there really hasn't been an indigenous leader. An awful lot of the cabinets have been made up of exiles. You've still got that phenomena running too much of the country. So I think first of all it's going to be somebody who is what my Iraqi friends call an impat as opposed to an expat. Probably will be a Shia. Will have to be a Shia because of the demographics. But will probably be more secular, will not have the ties to Iran that a lot of the exile groups do, and is going to put himself forward as an Iraqi nationalist. Now, there's a very strong history in Iraq there's the Pan-Arabist trend, and there's what's called the Iraqist trend, a very awkward word. But I think he's going to have very strong Iraqi credentials and be tough enough to be able to pull the country together, but he's not going to be able to do it simply by force. He's going to have to do it by being able to sort of create the national leader persona that is enough to be able to placate the Sunnis and the Kurds and make them feel comfortable with him, be Shia enough, but not theocratic, not indebted to Iran, and somebody who doesn't probably have much of a past relationship with us.
Have to walk on water.
No, I mean, it's kind of a Gorbachev-like figure is what it's going to be.
Question is how.
Which is, it may very well be a transition figure. I'm sorry.
Somebody like that have avoided getting shot by Saddam.
There are people like that, and one of the things that surprised a lot of us when we went into Iraq, because even though I had been there in the 80s, I wasn't really quite sure what to expect 20 years later, is a very sizable number of Iraqis who stayed, and they are the technocrats, and they are the intelligentsia, and some of them are in the military, mid-level military officers. Very strong Iraqi nationalists, not Saddamists, not Ba'athists, and they learned how to fly just below the radar. and thinking about what a new Iraq should look like. And one very brief story, trying to make it brief, is I was in charge of Baghdad City, among other things. And I go in, I'm in charge of a city of 7 million people. And I go in and I'm sitting with the 3 deputy mayors. The mayor is long gone. Deputy mayors and the director generals. And I said, I'm here. I'm supposed to be running the city, but I obviously can't do it without you. You're the technocrats, everything else. But I don't understand how this city is organized. And the deputy mayor says, tomorrow, this guy, and this guy will brief you on the structure of the city. So I come back the next day, and these 3 younger, 35-ish, director generals sit down, and they give me this briefing on how this medieval city of now 7 million is organized and structured and managed and everything. It was a beautiful briefing. It was absolutely fantastic. And then one of them stopped and said, and this is what we think ought to happen in the future. I wasn't on the program. And he lays out this plan for neighborhood councils that would become district councils, that would be both how the city would interact with the neighborhoods, how we would know what the priorities were in the different neighborhoods for reconstruction. It would be a bottom-up democracy. It was beautiful. It was almost textbook. This was all his. This is a guy who had been born and raised in Iraq under Saddam. Graduate of Baghdad University. And he had the whole neighborhood council bottom up, he had the thing nailed. And I had somebody from one of the democracy NGOs with me. And this guy said, you don't need me, he's got it. Another friend of mine was a professor of law at Baghdad University, born and raised under Saddam. She taught international law, human rights, and international conventions at Baghdad University under Saddam. The basic question was how. And her answer was, very carefully, she did it. She said what she did is that she talked always in terms of South Africa. That was the easy one. But she said, my students knew what I was talking about. So here is somebody who had thought through women's empowerment, human rights law, international conventions. These people are there. And what they do is they learned how to survive. Staying under the radar, but still, Faisal's plan to me on how to manage the city was not something he had come up with the night before, when he had been tasked to brief me on the city. This is something he had been working on for a very long time. The problem that they had, and this is what we saw with the Baghdad conference the end of April, when we brought a lot of these kinds of people together, is that they didn't know each other. We might know 4 or 5, the Brits might know 4 or 5, and we started bringing these people together. They had never had the opportunity, as the expats had, to really sit down in conferences and talk about and think about these things. So there was a development and a maturation process that they didn't have. And that's part of what I think we might have truncated with the de-Baathification the way we did, because some of these people lost their jobs and shouldn't have. They're there. They need the space and the freedom and the security to come forward. I'm afraid too many of them now may be in exile in Jordan. But he did not lobotomize that society. He might have suppressed it, but they were thinking very much about what they wanted their country to look like next. They're there.
Okay, do you want to take one more? Just stop. I think you had enough.
I think I can.
I think you had enough.
Thank you.